On what should have been an ordinary flight, a woman and her daughter were about to face a nightmare, one that would change their lives forever. In the cramped space of a plane, tempers flare, and a moment of cruelty leads to an unexpected conflict, putting everyone on board in danger. Rachel and Ava step onto the plane in Barcelona, ready for their journey to London. They've just returned from an emotional trip to Jamaica, a place that had held both pain and healing for them. Rachel, a strong woman, is looking forward to returning home after the loss of her husband. But arthritis makes each step harder, and she leans on Ava, her ever-supportive daughter. Ava, protective and loving, walks beside her, offering a smile that says everything. Together, they've faced so much, and this trip is a new chapter. Their bond is undeniable, a quiet strength between them as they take their seats, ready for the flight ahead. The flight was calm as Rachel adjusted in her seat, her hands resting on her knees to ease the discomfort from her arthritis. Ava sat beside her, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at her mother with a reassuring smile. Their moment of quiet was interrupted when Mark, a man with a sharp expression and an impatient stride, approached their row. "Move," Mark said flatly, gesturing at Rachel's seat. His tone wasn't just rude, it was commanding. Rachel, startled but calm, tried to explain, "I'm already seated. Give me a moment. It's a bit difficult for me to stand quickly." Mark rolled his eyes, his lips curling in irritation. "Difficult? You're blocking the way. Should have picked a better seat," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. Ava's eyes narrowed as she watched her mother brace herself against the armrest, trying to rise despite the pain. When Rachel finally managed to stand, Mark shoved his bag into the overhead compartment and sat down, his movements rough and dismissive. As Rachel settled back into her seat, he turned toward her with a sneer. "Figures," he muttered under his breath, loud enough to sting. "A woman like you, traveling like this." Rachel froze, unsure if she heard him correctly. Ava's jaw tightened as she caught the words and looked at her mother for a cue. Mark leaned back in his seat, his tone growing sharper. "Black women like you always think the world owes you something. What's next? You need help because you can't handle yourself." The tension between them thickened. Rachel's hands trembled slightly, but she stayed composed, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to want. Ava's voice finally broke the silence, firm and protective. "She doesn't need to explain anything to you." Mark smirked, as if pleased with himself, and muttered something under his breath again. The air in the cabin felt heavy, and the confrontation had only just begun. Ava couldn't sit still anymore. The moment Mark's words hit her ears, she felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her. She leaned forward in her seat, her voice sharp but steady. "That's enough," she said, looking directly at Mark. Rachel placed a calming hand on her daughter's arm, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Ava wasn't having it. She stood, her small frame radiating confidence. "You think you can talk to my mother like that? She's been nothing but patient with you." Mark scoffed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh look, now the daughter's stepping in. Like mother, like daughter, I guess." Passengers nearby began to murmur. Some turned to watch, their eyes darting between Ava and Mark. A few pulled out their phones, discreetly recording the unfolding confrontation. Ava ignored them, her focus solely on defending Rachel. "You don't get to treat people this way," Ava snapped, her voice rising. "You're the one causing a scene, not us." Mark's face darkened, his voice growing louder. "Causing a scene? Maybe if you two knew how to act properly, there wouldn't be an issue. People like you always think. People like us." Ava interrupted, her words slicing through his sentence. "You mean decent people who won't let someone like you bully them?" The tension in the cabin grew palpable. A flight attendant hesitated at the edge of the aisle, unsure of how to step in. Rachel's voice broke through, soft but firm. "Ava, sit down. Please." Ava hesitated, her jaw clenched, but she finally returned to her seat. The atmosphere remained tense, with passengers whispering and phones still recording. Mark, however, seemed unfazed, leaning back with a smug expression. The storm wasn't over yet. As the tension simmered in the plane, Rachel's thoughts drifted to her past, a lifetime of battles fought and won with quiet strength. Years ago, Rachel had arrived in London from Jamaica, full of hope but unsure of what lay ahead. The city greeted her with harsh stares and unspoken barriers. Finding a home and work wasn't easy, especially as an immigrant. Many doors remained closed, and those that opened came with conditions. Rachel vividly remembered her first job in a small cafe, where whispers followed her every move. Customers often treated her as invisible, while others made no effort to hide their disdain. Yet, she showed up every day, smiling, learning, and working harder than anyone else. Her resolve deepened when she became a mother. Raising Ava and her siblings in a world that wasn't kind to them became Rachel's mission. She worked long hours, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs at once, to make sure her children had opportunities she could only dream of. Cleaning offices at dawn, stocking shelves by afternoon, and sewing clothes late into the night became her routine. There were days when exhaustion hit her so hard she could barely stand, but she always reminded herself why she was pushing through. Every sacrifice was for her children's future, for their right to dream without limits. Rachel's strength was tested once more when she lost her husband. The grief was overwhelming, but she didn't crumble. Instead, she became the rock her family needed. She found ways to support her children emotionally and financially, teaching them the importance of resilience and kindness even when the world wasn't fair. As Rachel returned to the present, she glanced at Ava, who had just stood up for her so fiercely. Ava was proof that all her struggles had been worth it. Rachel's journey had shaped her into the woman she was today, someone who refused to let prejudice or hardship define her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the hum of the plane, but Rachel sat taller now, her inner strength undimmed. She knew this wasn't the first time she'd faced adversity, and it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Ava was by her side, ready to face the world with the same courage Rachel had taught her. Rachel sat silently, her heart heavy. Mark's cruel words echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than she expected. For years, she had built herself up, piece by piece, determined not to let the world's hatred break her. Yet here, in the close quarters of the plane, his insults seemed to strip away the armor she had carefully crafted. She tightened her grip on the armrest, willing herself to remain composed, but the pain was undeniable. Mark's words weren't just about her. They reflected a larger truth she had always fought to shield her children from. Despite decades of progress, the world still had moments like this, where prejudice and hatred found a way to remind her of how far there was to go. Rachel's thoughts drifted to her past struggles, the stares, the whispered slurs, the times she'd been overlooked or mistreated simply for existing. She thought she had grown used to it, that she had learned to block it out. But now, her heart ached not just for herself but for Ava. She had worked so hard to protect her children from moments like this, to give them a future free of the pain she had endured. Her vision blurred as tears threatened to fall, but she blinked them away, refusing to let Mark see her cry. Rachel wasn't broken. She was hurt, yes, but not defeated. She sat up straighter, drawing on the strength she had always relied on. Mark's words may have been cruel, but they reminded her of something far more powerful. She had survived far worse and come out stronger every time. And no matter how much hate tried to tear her down, she would never allow it to define her. Mark's voice rose above the hum of the plane, his words sharp and cutting. "You'll regret this," he spat, glaring at Rachel and Ava with a venom that made the surrounding passengers shift uncomfortably. His tone carried an unmistakable warning, each word intended to intimidate. Rachel remained seated, her back straight and her expression firm. Ava stood beside her, unyielding, her gaze locked on Mark. "We're not afraid of you," Ava said, her voice steady despite the tension filling the cabin. Her defiance only seemed to fuel Mark's temper. Flight attendants quickly stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat," one said, her tone professional but firm. Mark scoffed, throwing his hands up in mock surrender. "Oh, now I'm the problem? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking," he sneered, turning his attention back to Rachel and Ava. Around them, passengers began murmuring, their frustration with Mark's behavior growing louder. A man across the aisle shook his head and muttered, "Enough already." A woman in the row behind Rachel pulled out her phone, quietly recording the scene. Despite the flight attendant's attempts, Mark refused to calm down. His threats grew louder, each word an attempt to assert his dominance. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Rachel, still seated, met his gaze with quiet strength. "Your words don't scare me," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. Beside her, Ava added, "You can't bully us into silence." The tension in the cabin was almost palpable now, the air thick with unease. Passengers began calling out for Mark to stop, their collective frustration making it clear they wouldn't stand for his behavior. As the flight attendants called for backup and the captain was notified, Rachel and Ava held their ground, their resilience a stark contrast to Mark's increasingly unhinged outburst. Despite the fear and uncertainty swirling around them, they refused to let him win. The cabin had become a sea of tension, each word from Mark amplifying the unease. Just as Mark stepped toward Rachel and Ava with a threatening stance, a voice cut through the chaos. "That's enough." It was David, a tall man seated directly behind Mark. He rose swiftly, his presence commanding attention. David positioned himself between Mark and Rachel, his expression calm yet firm. "You've crossed the line," he said, his voice steady but resolute. Mark's face twisted in defiance. "This has nothing to do with you," he snapped, trying to push past David. But David didn't budge. "You're harassing them, and I won't stand for it," he replied, planting himself firmly in the aisle. Mark's frustration boiled over. "Who do you think you are?" he shouted, shoving David in an attempt to assert dominance. That's when everything escalated. Without hesitation, David reacted, gripping Mark's shoulders and pushing him back into the aisle. The sudden physical confrontation sent a wave of gasps through the cabin. Mark flailed, attempting to regain control, but David held his ground. The struggle grew more intense as passengers yelled for someone to stop the fight. "Get security," a voice called out, while others scrambled to pull out their phones and record the scene. The flight attendants rushed in, their voices drowned by the shouting. One attendant grabbed the intercom, urgently calling for assistance. Meanwhile, passengers in the nearby rows tried to separate the men, but the confined space of the plane made it almost impossible. The chaos rippled through the cabin, leaving everyone on edge. Amid the turmoil, Rachel held Ava's hand tightly, her eyes filled with both fear and gratitude for the stranger who had stepped in to defend them. As the fight subsided, the flight attendants rushed to regain control. Their voices carried a mix of urgency and authority as they urged David and Mark to separate. "Sir, please return to your seat," one of them said, gesturing toward David while another attempted to calm Mark, who was still fuming. Rachel and Ava sat quietly, shaken but composed, while the surrounding passengers exchanged murmurs of disapproval. It was clear to everyone who had witnessed the scene that Mark had been the aggressor from the start. After a brief discussion among the flight attendants, a decision was made. One attendant approached Rachel and Ava. "We're going to move you both to another seat," she said in a tone that tried to sound neutral but lacked empathy. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Move us?" she asked, her voice trembling with both exhaustion and frustration. Ava, sitting protectively close to her mother, added firmly, "Why should we have to move? He's the one causing all of this." The attendant avoided their gaze, clearly uncomfortable. "It's for everyone's safety," she said, gesturing toward an empty row farther back. Passengers around them began voicing their discontent. "Are you serious?" one man exclaimed. "They're the victims here," another woman chimed in. "Why isn't he being moved instead?" The murmurs of support for Rachel and Ava grew louder, but the attendants stuck to their decision. Reluctantly, Rachel and Ava gathered their belongings and followed the attendant, their dignity bruised. As they walked down the aisle, they heard whispers of encouragement and saw sympathetic faces. "This isn't right," one passenger said loudly enough for the crew to hear. The injustice of the moment hung heavily in the air. leaving a sour note among everyone watching. Meanwhile, Mark smirked, smugly settling back into his seat as if he had won. As the plane touched down, a heavy silence filled the cabin. The engines hummed softly, but no one spoke. The events of the flight had left an invisible weight on everyone. Rachel sat upright, her hands resting on her lap, gripping the armrest tightly. Beside her, Ava leaned against the window, her head tilted down, exhaustion evident in her posture. Though they exchanged no words, a silent understanding passed between them, a shared strength that had carried them through the ordeal. Passengers began to collect their belongings, their movements careful, as if not to disturb the tense atmosphere. Many glanced toward Mark, still seated in his original spot. He remained unbothered, staring out the window as if nothing had happened. Rachel looked at Ava, her voice soft but resolute. "We're okay," she said, her tone carrying both reassurance and determination. Ava nodded, her eyes reflecting both weariness and admiration for her mother's resilience. As the plane doors opened and passengers began to file out, some exchanged brief but meaningful glances with Rachel and Ava. A woman in the aisle whispered, "You're so brave," while another passenger gave them a small nod of solidarity. The flight crew, clearly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact with Rachel and Ava. Their earlier decisions had left a bitter taste in the mouths of many on board. Yet no one directly addressed Mark's behavior. He exited the plane without consequence, his smug demeanor unshaken. Rachel and Ava stepped into the terminal, the cool air providing a momentary relief. Though the flight was over, the emotional impact lingered. Ava slipped her hand into her mother's, and they walked forward together, knowing that while the journey had been painful, their bond had only grown stronger. Sitting on a bench in the terminal, Rachel and Ava finally took a moment to breathe. The chaotic flight was behind them, but the emotions it stirred were still fresh. Ava broke the silence first. "Why does this still happen, Mom?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with both anger and sadness. Rachel looked at her daughter, the pain in her own heart reflected in Ava's eyes. "Because some people refuse to see others as equals," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "But that doesn't mean we stop standing up for ourselves." Ava nodded, her expression resolute. "I was so scared, but I couldn't let him talk to you like that." Rachel smiled faintly, placing her hand over Ava's. "You were brave, and I'm proud of you. What Mark said, it doesn't define us. We've been through worse, and we'll keep moving forward." They sat in quiet reflection, the hum of the busy airport fading into the background. Rachel thought about her journey, everything she'd overcome to provide a better life for Ava. This was just another hurdle, and like every other time, she refused to let it defeat her. Ava broke the silence again, her voice stronger now. "I don't want to carry his hate with us. He doesn't deserve that space in our lives." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "Exactly. We're more than this moment. It's his burden, not ours." Standing up, they picked up their bags and walked toward their next gate, side by side. Despite the pain, they felt a renewed strength in their bond. As they moved forward, Rachel whispered, "We keep going, Ava. Always." Their steps were steady, their resolve unshaken, leaving the ugliness of the past behind as they embraced a future defined by hope and resilience. What would you have done if you were in Rachel and Ava's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Together, let's stand up for respect and kindness everywhere.